The following was translated from a previous recording. Hello everyone. I'm glad to see some of the usual faces and some new faces. And welcome to everyone who's able to log in. Here's our weekly journal club. I am up next to present to our lab. And today I'm presenting from the Journal of Terrestrial Archaeology, a fairly short paper. I'm sure we'll have some good discussion about it because I know that some of you out there will have some objections to some of the data. But from the Journal of Terrestrial Archaeology, I'm presenting a series of petroglyphs. No, I'm sorry, a series of petroglyphs discovered on Earth points to a cataclysmic Anthropocene-induced event. That's a mouthful, but obviously we have some folks who are studying Earth these days, and it is interesting that Martin et al. Had done these excavations just a year or two ago. This is from JTA of 3020. One of the earlier volumes of that period. And they discuss, the group discusses the 4 petroglyphs. I believe E is an archaic prefix for electronic petroglyphs that were recovered, presumably excavated with the vaporizing methodology that we've been using recently. On Earth, and these, as they say in the abstract, I'm going to go through it. They excavated these electronic devices called mobile telephones, and on these mobile telephones were displayed these ancient electronic drawings that were made presumably with something, some kind of software built into all of these mobile devices. These drawing apps, as they're called, had something, had these or electronic petroglyphs that were representations of apparently what was going on Earth way back in the 21st century as the so-called after-Christian era, as recent archaeological evidence points to, as they called their time periods, of some kind of event that was documented by 4 different people, but apparently all the petroglyphs are somehow related, so-called temporally, and that there was a connection over time, over many decades of the 21st century, and then these authors claim that ultimately that these petroglyphs do trace near and what we think now is the final extinction of Homo sapiens, aka humans or human beings, by early 22nd century. So let me go on. So this paper largely is discusses the discovery of the 4 petroglyphs and does some limited analysis of what's going on, of what they found. So let's move on to figure 1, and this is a typical example of an petroglyph. In this case, it shows a kind of punctate pattern. I'll come back to this, but each petroglyph is made by actually using this so-called the digits. There were 10 digits on humans at the time. And one of the digits, presumably a favored digit, was used to touch the material on the mobile device. I think the material is called glass, an amorphous but yet fluid material. When the digit made contact on the glass, there was electronically recorded a dot, if you will, with this particular diameter, and the digital contact was applied with a certain amount of pressure, and then left was the diameter of the dot, and so many dots then created these pictures. Here's one of them here. and it basically, long story short, with a holographic analysis that was done, and some deconvolution that was tried to be done to get a projection out of these devices of the original creator of individual one. That failed, by the way. They were able to determine from the hologrammetric data, the metadata, as well as analysis of, say, of this ePetroglyph 1, that is a source of heat coming from the bottom of the representation called a flame. And it is, in fact, lighting, if you will, a representation of Earth. And further analysis showed that those figures in the circle are apparently crude representations of the northern and southern continents as they were back then. I think Americas it was called. And the idea here, with more analysis, that the ePetroglyph is representing a 2-degree by decade increase in temperature on Earth. Yes, we have someone who's saying something.
But wait a minute. How could the excavations occur without the proper permitting? I mean, who can validate the authenticity of these representations?
Well, that's a very good question. In the notes, the permitting was documented. The methods were discussed. They are validated methods for use of levitated vaporization that happened upon discovery of these devices aerially. This is the first of the 4. So the methodology and the permitting, and I would say ultimately the validation does check out. Let's move on quickly. Very quickly, because I only have a short time here to present here. By the way, each figure does give the Earth coordinates, and you can look them up. They represent various cities that no longer exist. I believe this one is of the city, I believe it's San Francisco, but you'll have to look up the GPS. That's for your homework, so to speak. Figure 2, if we go here, briefly is a description, representation of a flora called tree. Analysis was done here, again, hologrammetric analysis, and showed that the bowing of the branches, the protuberances from this organism, show a stress factor that is significantly greater than was found in trees before the 21st century. So that's an indication of stress. It is thought that with the climate change that happened on Earth, and we all know it's been established by human-caused climate change, that this shows a dying tree and basically dying flora, and one could extend that to dying fauna on Earth. We go on to figure 3. In the next figure here of the ePetroglyph 3, more coordinates for you to look up. This is a very interesting one. It's more abstract, but as I mentioned earlier, that there was some communication apparently successively between one individual creator and the next in the course of the 21st century. So why is that significant? Because the story, the narrative is being told of what's happening on Earth. And ePetroglyph 3 is showing apparently a coronavirus on the ePetroglyph. And to the right of it is a series of matrices, punctate matrices indicating deaths, burials that were common with the burials of dead individuals that happened back then. And so there is a causation, if you will, and correlation between coronavirus and burial and death. And due to climate change, there was an exponential increase due to warming of conducive conditions on Earth for new viruses to emerge and infect a naive population. And we have substantial incidence of death moving toward, and this was dated around 2170, I believe, this particular petroglyph, or e-petroglyph. And so we have then, of course, the decline, heating, a decline of flora and fauna, and then ultimately starting a decline of Homo sapiens. Finally, in figure 4, this, I mean, it's very hard to read. I think this group could have done a better job with the excavation here, but that does, this is in a language called English. It says it with symbols L-I-K-E for the linguists out there, with something, a construct back in the 21st century called an emoji, which is ultimately its own representation, a pictogram, if you will. This one of an unhappy human figure face. This is reference to the so-called L-I-K-E riots of the late 21st century that happened. And I'm sorry if I said 2100. I did mean to say 2070 earlier, and this was probably around 2090, the late 21st century. The like riots that destroyed, according to archaeological evidence, about 80% of the human population, late 21st century. At this point, the riots were primarily due to basically survival instincts. There was a competition for remaining resources, and a lot of it was driven by these telephonic devices, which hosted, and everyone knows about the so-called technology called social media. And so social media communicated to the remaining population resources that were available, and there was a fierce competition for such resources for sheer survival of the remaining species, individuals of that species, and that is recorded in e-petroglyph 4. Oh, yes, I have another question. Yes.
How can you be sure of the interrelationships of the petroglyphs? There are lots of years, so-called Earth years, between them.
Well, that's a very good question. Again, we're relying on the metadata that was extracted through the hologrammetric analysis from them, but there are definitely particular codes that were associated with these devices back then, and it is a kind of concatenation of codes from the earliest to the next, to the next, to the next concatenation, where all of these codes were compiled, and therefore there was a linkage of communication there. And then briefly, I'm going to wrap up here. We have two figures, bar plots with standard errors regarding the punch pressures and diameters that were used to create these e-petroglyphs. And as you can see, according to real and model punch pressures that are compared respectively, as well as the real and model punch diameters, they're very close to each other. So we feel, that well, this group feels that these are legitimate e-petroglyphs, that they were made by Homo sapiens because the pressures and diameters are peculiar to this particular species. Yes, again, you asked the first question about validation.
Yes, I'd like to know, well, basically, where are the controls?
Well, getting back to you, there have been other excavations of e-petroglyphs from the earlier 21st century. They were using simpler devices than the ones you see here. We only have comparative data to look at. And to wrap up here, because this narrative unfolds to the point of the like riots, this group claims this is the last set of telephonic devices that will be discovered with e-petroglyphs, because the Lake riots, of course, was the final, if you will, global calamity, if you will, to strike Homo sapiens. And then the extinction record really runs out by the early 22nd century, by 2020. And there's been no other detection by aerial surveillance of Earth of any more devices 5 to 10 meters below the surface, assuming we can get to the surface because of the water depths, and that's been a little bit challenging. So are there any other questions to this? If not, okay. I guess one could say that this paper offers a kind of cautionary tale to us about our other fellow scientists out there at the other stations and planets, that close monitoring of atmospheric carbon output and temperature do represent a kind of proverbial canary in the coal mine, to borrow a very ancient phrase, in order to monitor the viability of a species and ultimately of a planet. All right, thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.